The first thing you should know is this. When a gate gets ripped off its hinges in the middle of the night, it doesn't feel like an accident. It feels like a sentence. The gate at our road, Ridgewood Hollow, a little sprawl of cedar houses and prideful lawns, was there the night before, leaning polite and ordinary. And the next morning it was a pile of twisted iron and a smear of tire treads leading away like a bad handwriting. I saw it from the porch with coffee in hand, and for a second I thought I was still dreaming. Then I saw where the logs had been stacked, how half the pile was gone, and my stomach dropped into a place that has a name for that kind of empty feeling. Legacy interrupted. My name is Evan Mercer. I'm not some big-shot contractor or a grievance YouTuber looking for drama, just a guy who grew up around wood and learned to read a tree the way other people read a book. Those logs were meant for a cabin. Not just any cabin. Me mother's voice would have agreed on the word sacred if she'd been here to say it. It was going to be a place for small things, a winter porch to smoke fish on, a bunk for grandchildren if I ever had any, and a beam over the fireplace where I wanted to carve her initials beside the year she taught me to splice a rope. I paid for those logs. I had the receipts, the GPS drop-off, the stamps burned into the ends. They were mine. So when they were gone, I did the thing anyone would. I called the sheriff. I called my neighbor. I called the company that delivered them to confirm the serials. I stood there with a notepad and a trembling hand while the deputy took pictures, and he tried to be helpful, really did, but you could tell he thought this was a weird neighbor dispute. People in Ridgewood Hollow have petty fights, sure. Fences get mistaken, hedges get trimmed, dogs get blamed. But this felt different. The tire tracks were too clean. The way the security wires had been cut was surgical. This was someone who knew exactly what they were taking. That's where the HOA shows up in the story. Ridgewood Community Association, seed of all the little pettiness that grows into something uglier if you let it. The president was a woman named Marlene Harth. Think church lawn society polished, the kind of smile that has clauses hidden in it. She wore pearl studs like armor and had a way of saying community standards that made the phrase sound like a verdict. We'd never had a problem, at least not until those logs vanished, and I, shaking and stubborn, marched into a Wednesday night meeting with a stack of receipts and a video still that showed a truck with a Ridgewood decal pulling away. She stood up at the podium, cool as a courtroom reporter, and scanned the room like she'd already judged us all. "This is about property lines, about compliance," she said. "Accusations are serious, and we will handle them according to our bylaws." That was the line. Hands in the air, polite smiles, everyone clinging to the idea that rules keep peace. I walked over and laid my paperwork down on the podium like a gauntlet. "These were mine," I said. "These are my receipts, my delivery GPS. Someone removed them in the night." Someone from the back laughed because of course they did, and Marlene's smile tightened into a seam. Her first move was to blame a paperwork error in Elasticsearch of HOA speak. "That means we want this to go away." She suggested a mediation. She suggested a private arbitration. She suggested that maybe I'd misunderstood the covenants. Meanwhile, a neighbor, one of those people who always shows up with an extra casserole and a hidden grudge, muttered that I'd brought logs onto the community easement. You could see the gears turning in Marlene's head. Control. Land is power. Paperwork is leverage. A gentle squeeze of the rules, and suddenly you can make people pay attention to you. I didn't want to fight. I wanted my wood. But you reach a point where the principle becomes the thing that keeps you from folding. I hired an attorney, a calm woman named Lena Rhodes, who smelled faintly of peppermint and didn't laugh at anyone's polite nonsense. She looked at my receipts and my photos and the GPS pins and said two sentences that settled something inside me. "This isn't a neighbor dispute. This is organized diversion." Then she filed a police supplement, and our thing moved from coffee shop complaints to case numbers and subpoenas. That's when Ridgewood's shiny exterior started to crack. Someone later revealed through a sticky, regrettable Slack leak was orchestrating. The messages were clinical and petty at once. "We can't have his cabin," one read. "If it goes up, values shift." "Neighborhood aesthetic compromised." Another, "We'll redirect the delivery next week. Make sure it's untraceable." Those messages felt like someone had shoved a mirror into the face of everything I thought my town had been. Neighborly, fair, garden variety petty. Instead, there was intent. There was motive. There was greed dressed up as stewardship. We found a forensic forester to look at what remained of the logs' broken stubs hidden in someone's pavilion. He compared grain patterns, bark remnants, and the stamp codes they matched. He could say, with the rough confidence of someone who talks to trees for a living, that those timbers had come from the same lot. The GPS breadcrumbs lined up with Ridgewood subcontractors. And then came a slip-up by the person who thought they'd been clever. A contractor's invoice with a Ridgewood Commons header, dated the night the logs vanished. Small things, layered one on another, make the kind of evidence a courtroom likes. Before we got there, before the judge banged down a gavel and said words that felt like vindication, things escalated in ways I wouldn't have chosen. Somebody painted my truck's tires with red dye so the prints would look like mine after the theft, and a late-night driver put a note on my door threatening retribution if I pursued this. The note had handwriting that trembled with anger and a signature that was more a shape than a name. For a long time I sat in my living room with those notes on the table, and the wind outside sounded like pages flipping. There was a community rally that I hadn't asked for. A few neighbors I'd exchanged waves with for years, real people, not the tidy, property-obsessed ones, came over with folding chairs and thermoses. They handed me hot coffee and photographs taken from porches, and I felt something fragile and human that had nothing to do with bylaws, solidarity. That's when the story tilted, because control depends on isolation. When people talk, when they share, the narrative that Marlene and her handful of allies were trying to tell about property values and neighborhood harmony started to look thinner. The courtroom day, if you want to picture it. Think clear light, and a judge who has seen too many lies look like truths. Lena placed the exhibits out like a quiet accusation. Stamped log ends, delivery will timestamps, the Slack messages printed and bound like a bad diary, emails with subject lines that read like excuses. Marlene sat stiffly, pearls catching a courtroom light, and her lawyer, someone smooth and practiced, tried to argue that the HOA had acted in good faith to protect the community. It's amazing how paperwork can be turned into a shield. But then we played the recording security camera footage from a neighboring property that showed the truck with the Ridgewood decal, the driver quick and focused, the guys loading wood like they'd done it 100 times before. The Slack messages were read aloud in a voice that left no room for plausible deniability. The judge, who had seen a lot of pettiness in his tenure, sat back and let the silence settle, heavy and exact. When he finally spoke, it wasn't theatrical. He called it what it was, an unauthorized diversion of property, and ordered remedies that were both civil and criminal in consequence. Fines, restitution, and a reprimand that would show up in minutes and records. The room breathed. You might think that's the ending: criminal findings, a paper trail, a guilty look from a woman who used to smile at board meetings. But endings are never that clean. For every formal consequence, there's a fallout: neighbors who picked sides, friendships that can't be unpicked, gossip that settles into the corners like dust. Marlene protested. Of course, she called it a witch hunt and insisted she'd been protecting property values. She said, publicly, that the HOA had acted within its charter. In private, she sent messages that read like someone trying to stitch a reputation back together. After the verdict, people came by. Not all to shake my handsome, to demand explanations, to relitigate things that had already been settled. I rebuilt the stack, ordered new timbers, and with the help of those few neighbors who had shown up with nails and good humor, we put the first beams up one slow, honest afternoon. I carved my mother's initials above the mantel myself, hands splintered and steady. The cabin took a shape that was less about property and more about making, sweat, laughter, a terrible microwave-cooked meal eaten inside because we hadn't set the stove yet. It was messy and beautiful, and I would have sworn that for a while the town could see that it wasn't about last names or property values, it was about people. But there's a last act to this story that's quieter and harder to fix: the question of power. When a small group can manipulate rules to suit itself, community becomes a theater where the props are legal papers and the audience is only ever allowed to clap in prescribed ways. I see people now who walk through Ridgewood like they own the story, and I see others who step lightly, as if every glance might be a rebuke. There was a meeting after the trial, more than usual, tension heavy, and Marlene stood and said she'd learned a lot about transparency. Her voice was measured, it sounded rehearsed. People nodded, some out of relief, some out of fear. I wondered which. That's what haunts meth: idea that a small, secretive squeeze of power can make whole lives feel precarious. It's not the logs in the end. It's the knowledge that those logs could have been anyone's medical records, a mortgage file, Someone's medicines and the rules could be bent so quietly you only realize you're trapped when the door's already closed. So maybe the most satisfying scene isn't the gavel. Maybe it's the day a neighbor Mrs. Alvarez from across the lane, who I saw as a silhouette for years, brought over a tray of empanadas and a ledger she'd kept of community diligence, and said, "If they ever try that again, we'll bring this." It's small. It's human. It's the opposite of secrecy. There are things I won't forget. Marlene's smile when she thought she could control the story, the way her supporters framed everything as duty, the quiet of the courtroom right before the verdict. There are things I didn't expect to learn. How much I could lean on strangers when I needed to. How quickly a town's niceties can turn to armor. And how carving initials into a beam can feel like carving out a space of truth in a world that prefers manufactured narratives. I'll tell you this, because maybe you need to hear it. Rules are useful until they're a weapon. Covenants can make a neighborhood orderly, sure, but make them tools of control, and they stop protecting people and start protecting power. If I have any advice, though, I'm not a preacher. Keep your receipts, keep your friends, and listen to the awkward neighbor who hands you a photograph at 2 in the morning, because if you're lucky, they'll be the one who notices when things go missing. So where does this end? The cabin stands. The beam holds my mother's initials, and Ridgewood Hollow breathes and argues and goes on. Marlene stepped down eventually publicly. She cited health reasons. I don't know what she'll do next. Maybe she'll run for a seat on another board. Maybe she'll volunteer somewhere and rebuild something of the image she lost. People change, or they don't. The housewarming I threw, if you could call it that, felt like a small victory, but I left space at the end of the night for argument, for mess, for conversation. I wanted people to talk, to disagree, to show their faces. If you took anything from this story, tell me what you think. Was I right to press it all the way to court? Did the HOA have a point about maintaining property standards, or did a few people use the rules to grab what wasn't theirs? Drop a comment and tell me how you'd react if someone tried to take the thing you were building. What would you do? Share if you've seen small rules used as big weapons in your own neighborhood. And if you like this kind of deep dive, subscribe for more stories where people push back against the quiet kind of power that thinks it can get away with everything. Debate me civilly, please, because the thing that fixed Ridgewood wasn't a judge alone. It was people talking, and people refusing to pretend like nothing happened.